Okay. Hi, everyone. Wish I could see everybody's faces. I'm so glad everybody joined us for tonight's forum. My name is Earl Pike. I work at University Settlement along with a couple of the other people on the call. And tonight's forum is called Race and Class in the Beloved Community. It's one of a series of events actually that we're doing this week of Homecoming, an event that we do every year. Last night we had this lovely dog walk in partnership with Neighborhood Pets. And tomorrow, Jennifer Eberhardt, who was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant some years ago for her work on race and policing, will be speaking at our luncheon. But tonight's panel, the intention of tonight's panel is to allow an opportunity to go a little bit deeper, maybe on the policy side or the strategy side, on a key issue affecting the community or key issues affecting the community. And of course, as everybody on the panel knows, and as those of you who have signed up know, it can't get much more crucial than talking about race and class in Slavic Village. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, Cynthia Connolly. For those of you who know Cynthia, no introduction is possible. I'll say that. She is a lifelong social justice advocate. Cynthia, I literally imagine you in your crib organizing some kind of protest about dinner or something like that. She's a member of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indian in northern Michigan. She earned her BA, and I didn't even know all this until I looked it up, so I'm even more impressed by you, Cynthia, than I was a couple of days ago. She earned her BA in American Culture and Native American Studies from that other university in Michigan that we won't talk about, and a master's in Public Administration and Nonprofit Management from Cleveland State University. She served as a youth representative to the National Congress of American Indians, a lecturer at Kent State University, the Resource Development and Governance Manager at Ohio City, Inc. And since July of 2015, she's been the Development Director of Policy Matters Ohio. I had the pleasure of serving on Policy Matters board, so the irony is that I was Cynthia's boss, and now she's my boss because she's also Vice President of the Board of University Settlement. And in addition to that board membership, she's also on the executive committee of the Lake Erie Native American Council, an organization that she and her husband, Joe, have really been building up over the last couple of years. And she serves on the board of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy in Washington, D.C. Probably most importantly, because I just value this about you and everybody who's sort of a family person, she and her husband, Joe, live in Ohio City, and they're dedicated parents to their two daughters. So dedicated, in fact, that she just returned from a trip to Disney World where the heat and humidity was 111 degrees, but they made for a great experience for their kids. So I want to turn it over to you, Cynthia. Thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to everybody for joining us tonight.
Oh, thanks, Earl. Yeah, I don't really start with all of those, the degrees and all that. And so when I meet people out and about in the neighborhood, but no, Earl laid it out. I grew up actually in Detroit, in northern Michigan, moved to Cleveland in 2007. I started coming here in 2006, moved here in 2007. My husband works over at NASA Glenn as an aerospace engineer. He's also Native American. So it's really great to be here in Cleveland, part of the University Settlement family. Honestly, could think of no greater organization with Earl at the helm. So happy to be here tonight and moderate this conversation. We, for just a quick ground rules, I want to set some housekeeping here. Rules of engagement, if we can copy and paste those into the chat, Grace, that would be really helpful for the attendees. Please use the Q&A button. It should be located at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, the little two bubbles with the Q&A. Use that to directly ask any questions to us panelists. We will see those and be able to work those in as we can. And then also our event facilitators at University Settlement, Grace and Sarah, they do reserve the right to remove any attendee if they are disruptive to the meeting, which is using any profanity, discriminatory language, vulgar references, mind your manners kind of situation. We are talking about, a pretty uncomfortable and at times heavy topic. So let's be mindful and civil in this conversation. So setting those ground rules. Today we are talking about race and class. So here's my little spiel. Let me get my notes. While different social constructs, they can overlap in many ways, both personally and in our own communities. It is important to understand the difference between race and class and the role that each plays. Race has been a strong topic of conversation in America in the past few years, especially with the Black Lives Matters movement and the recent verdict for George Floyd. And particularly in regards to discrimination and also bias is another topic we've been hearing about lately. So today we will sit at that intersection of race and class with the goal of moving forward towards creating a more just and equitable neighborhood and society for the Slavic Village neighborhood. I'm introducing our 7 panelists. We have wonderful people here today. And I'm going to start with Phyllis Cleveland, our former city councilwoman. So the way I'm actually going to do this is I'm going to call you each out. And if you could give me your name, your affiliation, and maybe one characteristic. It's going to be really tough, so I'm really putting you on the spot. One characteristic that you see or feel or believe is in a beloved community. So I'm going to start with Phyllis. Are you live? Okay. I'll start with Phyllis Cleveland.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for moderating this important discussion, Cynthia. And good evening to my fellow panelists. Phyllis Cleveland, as of about 10 days ago, I am the former councilwoman for Ward 5, which includes the North Broadway and Hyacinth neighborhoods in Broadway Slavic Village. And I served this community as well as the entire Ward 5 for 16 years. Definition of beloved community, or is that your question, Cynthia?
Yeah, just one word or phrase that jumps to you when you think of a beloved community.
Inclusive.
Okay, we're gonna go over to Tom O'Brien.
Thanks, Cynthia. It's good to be here with everybody. I'm Tom O'Brien. I'm the Director of Neighborhood Connections, Community Building Initiative in Greater Cleveland. And I used to work in Slavic Village, Broadway, in the early 2000s. My definition or a couple of words would be love and power. People really caring about each other, but people also having power to make change.
Great, and moving over to Tim.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Tim Francisco. I'm the outlier here because I'm in Youngstown, where I direct the Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State University. I'm also vice chair of the Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley, which is a foundation devoted to social determinants of health and equitable public policy. I think if I had to come up with one phrase on the spot to define a beloved community, it would be shared purpose.
That's great. And go over to Pastor Gibson.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks also to University Settlement for convening us. Richard Gibson, pastor of Elizabeth Baptist Church in the Hyacinth neighborhood. I also serve on the board of University Settlement. And the phrase that I would use is love and respect.
Absolutely. Chris?
Hi there. Yes, Chris Alvarado. I've had the pleasure of serving as the executive director for Slavic Village Development. It will be 7 years on June the 3rd. And a characteristic that I see in a beloved community is empathy.
These are great words. Moving over to Ed.
Hi, I'm probably the one guy here that has the one thing I have in common is I'm actually a resident of Slavic Village. I'm a community Yahoo. We do projects in the neighborhood that try to inspire people to have conversations and try to bring everybody together. I'm also a activist that specializes in abandoned homes and dump sites throughout the Slavic Village area. My word would basically be evolution. That's my word.
Anastasia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasia, and I'm the policy strategist with an organization called the Freedom Bloc, which stands for Black-led Organizing Collaborative. And I think the best, I would define a loving community as just being compassionate and having an open mind. Thank you.
All right, thanks all of you for joining us. So I just have a couple questions laid out here. And of course, a reminder, if you have a question, attendees, please hit it in that Q&A box and we'll work it in as we can. First question, I really want to set the context of this conversation because we can't talk about today without talking about yesterday and in our historical context of Slavic Village. So to Chris, and we'll start with Chris, and then also I know Phyllis, you know, your years in council, of course, probably have things added to here. Give us a brief history of the neighborhood. So we don't need a full timeline, but in the context of race and class, maybe just a little bit of backfilling information of what Slavic Village has experienced over the last several decades.
Real good. I'll keep this as brief as possible. So Ed's word was evolution, and that very much describes the Broadway Slavic Village neighborhood. You know, when you say Slavic Village, you think immediately of the Polish community, the Czech community, the Slovenian community, etc. And while yes, a lot of our culture is based in that, those weren't the first folks to come to the area that's known as Broadway Slavic Village. In fact, you know, you're really talking about a progressive succession of folks who called this place home. So, for example, we have Mound School that was called Mound School because it was near adjacent to Native American mounds that were developed, that were, you know, here in our neighborhood going back centuries. Broadway Avenue was a Native American byway that connected Lake Erie with the Ohio River watershed. Those were the first folks to call this place home. The first Europeans to call this place home were not from Eastern and Central Europe. They were folks from the Isle of Man. They were folks from the British Isles. So what happened over the course of centuries, starting in the 19th century, is that you would have progressive waves of people coming into the neighborhood, calling it home. When the Ohio and Erie Canal was being dug, you had a lot of immigrants into the neighborhood from Ireland. So if you look at Holy Name School, for example, or Holy Name Church, the school that was there was called the Green Wave because it was an Irish parish. The first Eastern and Central Europeans to come to the neighborhood actually came as strike breakers. The folks who were from the British Isles, who were working the iron mills throughout the neighborhood, eventually went on strike because they realized that they were being taken advantage of by the owners of the mills. And instead of giving in, the owners of the mills placed advertisements throughout in places like Warsaw and Bratislava and Ljubljana, saying, come to Cleveland for these amazing experiences and making money. And they, of course, were taken advantage of. And so you had wave after wave of folks coming to Broadway Slavic Village to create a better life. And many of them did. The neighborhood up until 1990 was predominantly Eastern European, Central European, and a lot of immigrants from Appalachia. It was predominantly white. And there's a whole conversation about how different ethnic groups, as they came to the United States, became white. The Irish, when they first came to the US, were not considered white at the time. That was something that they were given as a result of bigger political social issues that I don't have time to talk about right now, but maybe others will allude to that as we go through this. So until 1990, in 1990 census, 3.5% of our neighborhood was Black. And that was when we began seeing more and more folks moving into the neighborhood, buying homes in the neighborhood. And there was a lot of racial tension in the neighborhood. In fact, there was an awful moment, an awful example in 1985 of a 67-year-old African-American woman, a grandmother named Nabel Gant, who was killed in a firebombing attack in her home in Broadway, Slavic Village. The suspect was never brought to justice. And it was one example of a number of attacks on the African-American community in Broadway, Slavic Village from folks who wanted to keep this neighborhood as it was, predominantly Eastern Central European, predominantly white. The community really banded together. There was a No More Hate March that took place in the spring of 1986. Broadway Peace and Diversity came up, and there was a real concerted effort among neighbors to embrace and to welcome the African American community here. And as a result of a number of different factors, one of which was welcoming folks of color into our neighborhood. The other one was white flight out of the neighborhood. You saw the demographics change over time so we're now very much a neighborhood that reflects the city of Cleveland as a whole. We're a little over half African American, about 41% white, so Eastern Central European folks from Appalachia, and a couple of percent Latino. In fact, that's one of the largest growing groups in Broadway Slavic Village is the Latino community. And so race is always a part of discussions that are had around investment, around our schools, around leadership and power.
Yeah, that was phenomenally done, Chris. Phyllis, did you want to add anything in there about kind of, the history or the changing nature or what you've seen in your time on council about, those community players, those voices and the people that, rose up and made Slavic Village what it was over the last 15 years?
Sure. And thanks for that history, Chris. And that was really enlightening. In my 16 years time, of course, I experienced, the current demographic shift to a majority Black community. And it just, from a personal or anecdotal standpoint, I grew up in Central, which is, maybe a mile away geographically, but a world away, in terms of, culture and other things. And particularly at the time that I grew up in Central, and even during the time that when I first became elected to council, one of my experiences that I've never forgotten is one of my first meetings with a group of residents, and I think they were all or mostly white. And, one of the first things people said to me, after I introduced myself is, well, we don't want public housing, So I was just thinking, well, wow, that's not why I'm here. That's not why, I wanted to serve the community. But I will say also those same people over time, I developed a good working relationship with. And I think it just came from, the initial reaction came from fear, fear of the unknown. Who is this person coming to our community to be our leader? And, you don't look like us, you don't know us, you don't live in our community. To, eventually, you try to build that trust and and that relationship and answer questions and be empathetic and be understanding. And so and now, the community has changed. It's more, more Black people have moved into the community. And as Chris said, there's a growing Latino population. So it's and a lot of other things have happened since then too, as well as the foreclosure crisis, the economic decline, continued economic decline in the neighborhood. All of these things, come to play. So, and but now you also got a growing social justice movement. So I think, there's just so many things that play in the neighborhood, and the demographic racially is key, but economically and from a class standpoint, I think most people in the neighborhood are of the same class, and race has always, been a tool to divide people who should be allies, based on their economic class. Now stop there.
No, that's great. And I'm going to squeeze in here really quick because I want to give Pastor Gibson a time to chime in here too. Because, we're talking to a council person, we have our CDC here, your settlement house. I'm really curious too, Pastor Gibson, from your point of view, from the faith-based community, what kind of changes you have seen over time, and maybe set the context a little bit for the faith-based community.
So thanks to both Chris and Councilperson Cleveland for the backdrop. So as many know, the faith community in our country has been historically divided. And so we moved to Slavic Village, to the Hyacinth neighborhood, just about 10 years ago. And our congregation at that point was probably 95% African-American. And so today I'm thrilled to say that we're probably at most 80% African-American. And, for what's happened during the pandemic, we've seen our congregation change dramatically. And so some of it's been intentional on our part, because we absolutely want to have a multicultural congregation. And so it's not just about what happens in our services on Sunday, but it's also about how we connect with the immediate community. And so, so I am encouraged that growth has occurred. I think it's still really challenging because in the faith community, there's so many things that have divided us, like the way you worship and how you come together. And so this is an opportune time to break down those barriers. And so we've seen that. And so if you were to come to one of our services, you're never going to come at this point and not have diversity and not see significant diversity.
That's great. So setting the tone a little bit more, I'm bringing in Tim right now. If you can kind of talk a little bit about how class is traditionally defined, because a lot of people are going to define race, social construct. People will define and add definitions, do a lot of things. But there's kind of some presumptions of what class actually is, and also what it is not. So if you wanted to chime in here really quick and kind of set the tone of what class is traditionally defined as more broadly, and maybe how that overlaps with race.
Sure. First, I want to say, wow, what a great group of people you have here. It makes me want to pack up and move to Cleveland. I mean, so far, this is a great conversation. So class, as you suggest, is a really difficult topic to wrap our heads around. And, really, with every political struggle, it becomes more and more a pressing issue. So I'll just kind of do a bare bones, class 101 here very quickly. Traditionally, sociologists and economists define class according to income, and they break that into stratas. So you would have upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, and then working class. Within those categories are different kinds of labor. Okay, that's sort of a bare bones definition. That said, As the study of class, and again, I direct a Center for Working Class Studies, evolves and goes through different disciplines, we look at a fuller picture of class. So we think about things like education, culture, political power, and how those all figure into class relations. It's extremely important. I tend to think about class in terms of relationships to power. So who sets the rules of power, who has access to the rules of power, who enforces them, who essentially is forced to live by them, and then who is pretty much, you know, out of access and out of reach for all kinds of power. Of course, class also enfolds status, and status is a different kind of hierarchy. I won't belabor that, but I'm happy to follow up on any of these definitions. I do think when we talk about race and class, definitions get very troubled because we have to think about intersectional experience, right? So the experience of a Black upper middle class person is going to be quite different from the experience of a white upper middle class person. And that's consistent throughout each class category. Again, I think it's probably most helpful to think about class, particularly in these contexts, as access to power, access to resources, and the ways in which one's class position has disenfranchised or conversely given one advantages. So I think I'll stop there.
I'm going to push this a little bit further because I remember in a conversation,
Sure.
there being a comment about why there is a need to define specifically a white working class. We hear this a lot amongst our politicians.
Yeah.
We see commercials about it every election cycle talking about, you know, the white working class.
Sure.
What is the fascination with that, and what actually should we be talking about?
Well, so, you know, this is always a difficult conversation for me because of what I do and where I'm centered. But I think the white working class and the conversation around the white working class isn't new, but it's really been pushed to the forefront of the conversation since the rise of Donald Trump, you know, 2014 and 2015. And what you saw there was really the ability for that politician in particular to capitalize on a sense of resentment and disenfranchisement from political, social, and economic processes by white working class Americans. Now, in the popular imagination, the white working class tends to be associated with male industrial labor. And that is because to some degree, look, I live in Youngstown, and we are the backdrop for every media outlet across the world to parachute in every 4 years, stand in front of some ruin porn, you know, an abandoned mill, and talk about the Trump voter with the baseball cap, right? It's ironic because the city of Youngstown itself, like the city of Cleveland, is almost majority minority. And the working class in Youngstown is predominantly people of color, and they're not industrial workers. They're service workers. They're working in call centers. They're working in all kinds of different industries. The white working class, to me, and this is my opinion, troubles, because what the white working class tends to encourage is a kind of default to whiteness, and as opposed to a class position that unifies. You know, that in itself is, I realize, is somewhat naive, but traditionally, you know, labor organists, labor tended to think of class as a unifying concept, and they were trying to push for a redistributive model. The idea of the white working class to some degree fractures that, right? And it suggests that, you know, there are problems with that narrative. Another problem with the narrative is that you often hear, in combination with white working class, the notion of being left behind. That troubles as well, because it suggests that there's somehow a promise or an entitlement to one group of people that wasn't fulfilled, that doesn't take into account other groups of people who never had that promise to begin with. So.
Yeah, because when we started this conversation, right, and we talked about a beloved community. I mean, the words we have here are love, empathy, compassion, evolution, shared purpose, respect. Those are all the common threads, right, that we're hearing right now. So actually, I want to turn this over to Tom, and also get to Ed and Anna as well. Talking kind of more locally, right, about community engagement and kind of like the activism, neighborhood block club groups. You know, how has that changed, and what have been some of the challenges, and what have been some of the really great opportunities that you've seen? You know, I would even see before COVID, but even now after COVID.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. I mean, at the heart of place-based or, in a neighborhood change efforts, it really has to be about trust, right? And how do you create opportunities for people to build trust across lines of difference, whether it's racial lines, geographic, positional power, income, all of those different ethnicity, cultural, how do we create opportunities for people to come together to see one another in the other person, right? And then to see their commonalities and what they have in common and start to act together and support each other in that way. And I think that's a huge opportunity now. I think there's a lot happening to neighborhoods, right? All over, right? All of these different initiatives that are coming from the city or the county or from large institutions, they're not with people. And I think in order for them to be with people, the community has to have kind of that network of trusting relationships, and where people feel like they're included, they feel like they're heard, they feel like they're seen, and they have voice, right? And so I think that's at the heart of really the foundational part of doing any engagement in neighborhoods is centering residents and building relationships across those lines of difference and understanding. Now, how do you get there? I think some of it is meeting people who are different in spaces where you can actually have good conversations. They're not toxic environments, right? They're healthy, aspirational spaces where people find value. I think another way to do it is through education, right? Through understanding people's past and having opportunities to have conversations around trauma and healing that have happened over time to various populations for various reasons. I think that's all really important. And I think creating that civic infrastructure, right, where these conversations can happen over time. It's not episodic. It's part of the fabric of the community. That the civic infrastructure is there for this to happen, these conversations and relationships to be built. And there's many spaces for that to happen on an ongoing basis, whether it's a church, it's a community group, it's out of a library, could be on a block, any of those things. And lastly, I would just add that there has to be action involved, right? I think, so talking is good and it's relationship building, and there is some action out of that, right? But it has to generate into kind of the infrastructure. How are people going to be mobilized to move to action in their self-interest, in their community self-interest, right? Whether it's around creating community gardens, whether it's around getting healthcare for everybody, whether it's around getting good paying jobs in the neighborhood, whatever those things are. But it all starts with that relationship building and creating spaces for that to happen. And there's various ways to do it. But I think to me, that's really at the heart of it. Just a few years ago, when I was at Broadway, we tried to do that across lines of difference. This was in like 2002 to 2007, I was there. And we started a group called Broadway Diversity in Progress, which was named by the residents and community members involved. And it was bringing people together across lines of difference, especially racially, African Americans with the older white population and Appalachian population, to start getting to know each other, to building trust, and then to act together. And I think there were seeds in that I think had real promise that, the work we're doing now in North Broadway, I think has some of those same seeds, So I'll stop there. I would say one approach, the approach we use at Neighborhood Connections is called community network organizing, which is really about relationship building, mutual support, and collective action, both.
Yeah. So that's all great. Education, civic engagement, those are all key things. And I think that's also kind of really lead into a question that I want to get into a little bit later about inclusion and power. But I did want to give Ed and Anna a chance to chime in here. In our prior conversation, we did talk, a little bit about, about wealth building and how that has been inequitable in the history of this country through bad policy, deliberate actions rooted in racism, but also the fact that, Slavic Village has kind of this, history with housing, being the ground zero for the foreclosure crisis in 2008, and really, struggling to overcome it. So many neighborhoods in Ohio have not quite recovered from the Great Recession. And so, Ed, and I will start with you. What opportunities do you see in housing, and how has that kind of shaped the neighborhood and the challenges in the neighborhood?
Well, the one thing that I've noticed is that I read a lot about how the housing market is pretty volatile right now. You hear stories about how people are having trouble buying houses and stuff like that because there's just not enough stock. And then I look at a neighborhood like ours where we have tons of land, tons of opportunity to be able to build, and it doesn't seem to be happening. And I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. I really think that we're trying to set the mood for the next generation to buy houses. I pretty much I think most of the people that will already live in this neighborhood, the adults anyways, will be long dead when we start seeing actual development in this neighborhood, because it just doesn't seem to be something that's a priority, even though there's this vast housing market developing. And part of it's because of property values being so low. We read about it all the time. The banks won't give home loans for a property that's under $50,000. Most of our property here is like 20,000 and less. So you have to literally put a new house on that property for it to give it any value. So until new housing starts developing in this neighborhood, my fear is that we're not going to be able to touch into that market to be able to get new housing and new properties. I mean, the Broadway Horizon project, of course, great project that, I love it because it's going to be expiring some townhomes and stuff like that around there. And North Broadway, I personally feel like is ripe for redevelopment because it is so close to downtown Cleveland. And I think the pandemic actually is going to kind of slow that down a little bit because, where people were wanting to be close to downtown and, maybe they didn't want to be in the hustle and bustle of Tremont or something. But until that kind of reignites and refires, I mean, it's sad that we're not able to touch into this market and hearing all these people like they're bidding after a house that's $300,000 and there's 15 people bidding for that house and then one person's winning and then they all move on. But those are all in the outer ring suburbs. You're not hearing about that stuff in Garfield Heights. You're not hearing about it in Maple Heights. You're not hearing about it in the inner ring suburbs as well. So we're kind of in this corner, and then we kind of lead the charge from Maple Heights and all that, where it doesn't seem to be, we don't seem to have an ability to tap into that housing market. And that's, to me, that's pretty tragic.
Yeah, and I wanted to give a chance for you to talk a little bit about, about inclusion and power specifically. I know you do a lot of the community organizing and with, was it Freedom Bloc? So if you wanted to, because you really segued nicely into there. I think you touched a little bit too, Ed, on not being really seen, heard. I know there's conversations in the past about Slavic Village. It came with a stigma, right? Where people were, they said where they were from. I live in Slavic Village, right?
Yeah, well, the wording I gave when we had the discussion was whenever you tell somebody you're from Slavic Village, right away they're like, oh, you live over there? How do you not get shot? How do you not walk around with a bulletproof vest? I walk in abandoned houses all the time and without so much as a gun, nothing, and whatever. There's also a stigma being a Caucasian, because I think amongst my peers, they kind of look down on me a little bit sometimes, where they're like, wow, we live in Parma, you live in Slavic Village. So there's automatically this stigma about being in Slavic Village. And though, like I said in the phone call, I think those of us that live in Slavic Village, I think we kind of wear that like as a badge of honor and not as a badge of shame, because we've stuck it out. We're continuing to sit here and work. And a lot of us that are still here are trying to make this a good community for everybody, not just for one particular race or anything like that. We're just trying to make it a good livable community and trying to fight for it. So, yeah.
Yeah, Anna, so for you, you go ahead. It seems like you have something to say, so go ahead and jump in if you wanted to chime in there.
Oh yeah, no, I think everybody's just had such, wonderful things and to say, and I've just been kind of, thinking about everything. And I think, the best way to really amplify the voices in Slavic Village is to help, the community members to understand their political power by mobilizing the community. And I think that simply, starts with, making sure your neighbor is registered to vote and then engaging in that conversation, right? So a lot of people I've noticed in my work, they don't understand how their vote matters. Or a lot of people, only vote in major presidential elections and things like that. We saw a lot of that last year. And no one really votes, on the off-year elections. This year we have our mayoral election coming up, as well as the CD11 congressional district election coming up. And so I think it's, having those conversations with our neighbors for them to understand, why, these local elections are just as important to turn out to the polls just as much and with just as many numbers as they would, a normal, 2020 presidential election. I think people only vote on those elections, which are, so far up and don't see the change in their community and then don't feel like they have no power. And it's not true. A lot of local elections are won by a small margin of 100 votes or 50 votes. So I think people need to understand that you have to, if people came to the polls at those rates, then you're going to see the change that you want, or at least you're going to understand how whoever wins, how that was effective. In my work, I think also in Slavic Village specifically, being in the Cleveland area, just knowing, for someone who is an active voter, but they may not understand how to be involved, just being aware of other organizations that do exist, so you can kind of be part of those organizations. And if you want to branch out and do your own thing, that's good. But we have, NOVA, Northeast Ohio Voters Advocates. There's Cleveland Votes. There's YLN, the Young Latino Network. There's new organizations like mine, the Freedom Bloc. There is OPAL, which is the organization for Pacific Islander Asian women's Asian women. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that acronym, but there's many different community organizations that are doing, voter registration, voter education, to help people understand, and then to give them the access and the tools to reach out even further. So for Freedom Bloc, for example, not only do we, canvass and have voter registration, but we offer Black political education classes for our, for our base. So they understand, okay, you could come in, be part of this class, and then once they've gone through our class, then we, empower them to go out and teach it to 5 to 10 people that they know, because it's really just branching out in that grassroots way. And then again, other opportunities, if we always need poll workers in more inner city areas. So becoming a poll worker, and just really doing, phone banking, text banking has become really popular with COVID as well, because people couldn't really have those face-to-face engagement, which is really important. That's how I met Earl Pike here, just door-to-door canvassing. So, I just think just really getting back to that old school, just kitchen table conversations, because that's kind of where it starts. And that's where a lot of that power is. So yeah, I think I answered that question.
No, that's great. And again, just a reminder, if you have a question, please hit it in the Q&A and we'll work it in throughout the program. So I have a question right here. And this is probably for Anna, and then also for Tim, Chris, if you want to chime in on this. The question is, if class is roughly defined by who has power and access to resources, how do you empower lower class or people who live in urban or rural impoverished neighborhoods? I don't know who wants to take that one first. Maybe Chris, Tim, you guys haven't spoken in a little bit.
If you want, I'll start off and then hand it to Chris, if that's okay.
Sure. This is a question from Carla.
Okay, thank you for the question, Carla. It's a really good question. And I think that part of what's happening around that question is that right now we're having a lot of conversations in the United States about systems change, right? So when we think about resources, when we think about access to resources, we almost have to backtrack and think, how does one gain access? And I'm betting Anna would have something to say about this as well. But I can give examples from my work with the Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley, right? So we are all about social determinants of health, equity, and access. And what we've begun to do is kind of an audit of all of our systems and processes for how we make grants, for how we invite people into the grant making process, to how we do distribution, right? Because we're recognizing that even some of the slightest procedures are disenfranchising people in the very people in impoverished and rural neighborhoods, as you mentioned, that we're trying to serve. So we need to concentrate on things like civic infrastructure was mentioned, I think, by Tom. I think that's incredibly important. I think infrastructure in the broad sense that, and you know, don't jump on me for this, folks, but the way that President Biden is talking about infrastructure, right? That it's not just a physical built environment, it's things like broadband, it's things like training, it's things like access to food and medical care. These are the issues, by the way, that cross color lines, right? When we think about that kind of what I would maintain is an artificial divide between the white working class and the working class, right? Well, the entire working class needs better healthcare. The entire working class needs better access to technology, safer neighborhoods, and cleaner environments. And I do think that the way that the current administration is tackling that holistically, right? That you can't separate from one to the next is a nice start. But like I said, I'm sure Chris and Anna have more to say on this. So.
I'm going to actually defer most of this to Anna, but I will say that an important part of this, of providing folks with power and access to resources has to be for those of us who already hold power to defer that power in every way that we can to our residents, to those who are directly affected by the decisions made by elected officials, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's I'm happy you said that, because I was definitely gonna mention how like a lot of it needs to come from our allies to kind of help support these policies, but also on us, you know, calling legislators and, you know, having these conversations so they understand and know what we want. And that's definitely part of what we are trying to empower our base to do in Freedom Bloc, is to, you know, get on the phone, you know, train them to make testimony for policies that kind of support these issues that are currently working in the State House and things like that. So definitely with access to higher education, better access to higher ed, definitely, and with affordable housing. Some of our biggest platforms within Freedom Bloc is, you know, definitely access to healthcare, minimum wage, raising minimum wage to a workable, livable wage, which are all issues that affect us all the same. And so I'm really happy that you kind of touched on that, Tim, with like, even though there's this racial divide, it still hits us all. So, you know, we can hopefully come together as the working class to really kind of, you know, break down this structure so that, these more socially progressive policies can hopefully be on the forefront soon.
Hey, can I add something?
Oh yeah, go. I'm sorry.
No, just I'll be real quick. One thing that we really need to address is things like internet. If anybody's not familiar, there's actually something called a digital divide. And I recently became aware of this because I was paying AT&T for full price for 10 MPS internet when they advertise, on their other servers, like, what was it, like 150 MPS. So a poor family, especially because I'm connected to the central line all the way over by Kinsman and stuff like that. So they give actual subsidized internet. And so they give them the 10 MPS internet. Now, the nationwide average is actually about 20 to 30 MPS. I right now I have Spectrum. I have like 230 MPS. But imagine a family of 4, right, going to school and having to do everything online with 10 MPS internet. So you have like 4 devices working off 10 MPS internet. That's ridiculous. So that's something that I think that definitely is something that affects everybody. That access to internet and equal, especially in this digital age where everything is digital, and schools are more progressively using a lot of stuff like that. I think having access to internet and having access to technology, I think, is going to be a big deal in the coming years.
Yes. Tom?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one small thing. I mean, one is about the idea of institutions stepping back. I think that's really important, right? So institutions need to step back and listen to community and work with community rather than for or to, right? And I think too often decisions are being made on policy or on laws or on just everyday work that's made in isolation within the institution and of the institution's self-interest. So the more that community members really are at the table, and not just sitting at the table, but are meaningfully at the table, right? Shared power, having a sense of, really directing what's happening with the institution, I think change will happen that way. The second thing I'd say is who you know, it makes a difference who you know, right? And I know in many of our lives, who we know led us to be sitting right here in these seats. If we all look at where we started out, and a lot of times people who are marginalized because of race, power, poverty, all those different things, they're treated much differently than people who are educated. They're told to go through a program, right? Or take this class, this special class. What I say is, let's create spaces for people really to get to know each other and meet people they normally wouldn't meet, right? And things can change for people in that way too. So I think it's all of those things. And then the third thing I just say is just the internal, right? My people as people. I think there needs to be more space for that, for healing, for understanding, for dealing with some of the traumas that we've all faced, far more than others because of racism and poverty and the structures that oppress. And there has to be space to deal with those things for people to recover from those.
Yeah, good. That's amazing. So I wanted to squeeze one more question in from Douglas. And it really piggybacked off a lot of what Anna and Ed has been saying. And it says, we need to talk specifically about literacy. None of this happens if people can't read. So kind of pinging this over to former Councilwoman Phyllis Cleveland. How has Cleveland been tackling literacy, specifically in Slavic Village? Maybe, Chris, how big of a problem is this? And I know digitally, I have a 5-year-old who doesn't quite know how to read yet, and it's hard for her to do her online work unless somebody reads it to her. So now we're talking about, some of our younger ones getting set back over this last year during COVID. So Phyllis, if you want to talk a little bit about literacy specifically in Slavic Village or Cleveland in general.
I can speak to Cleveland in general. And I suspect that Slavic Village is similar to the city of Cleveland, where we have a literacy rate of under 50%, maybe even under 40% of Clevelanders, who can read at a ninth grade level. And so, obviously there's systemic issues that, number one, go to our school system and their inability to teach people to read. But it also predates that, going back to the home environment where, I think we all know that, in a, let's say in a middle class or affluent home, or even a working class home, if the parents are engaged in education, if they have some educational background themselves, if they have books in the home, if they, engage with their children on that level, reading to them and modeling reading, for their children, you got kids who come to school better prepared to learn how to read and to learn in the institutional school environment. But in many households, you're lacking those things. The parents, one or more, or guardians, may not have a lot of formal education. They may not feel competent to teach their own children how to read or to help them with their homework. So, hence we've got the population, the literacy level that we have. There are other programs out there now that are trying to tackle that, like Seeds of Literacy, and certainly a lot of community organizations and churches, have their own literacy programs to try to help adults, bring them up to a literacy level where they can, where they can function and they can do, basic, math, and then, be able to actually, be in a position to be trained for the digital economy. So, yeah, I think, the digital divide is, is broadband, but it's also, much more than that. It's, and it goes back to that basic literacy level, which goes back to poverty and the same issues that we see reflected in every other problem that we have in our society.
Yeah, and we're also talking, looking at financial literacy and the ability to, protect each other from predatory lenders, from your family. And so there's a lot of other kind of, when we talk literacy, it's not just reading a book. We can also talk about, technology literacy, which is going to be and is the future. It's the now. And I mean, my 5 and or my 6 and 8-year-old both know how to use, their iPads better than I can now. And I'm a millennial. I'm not afraid of technology. So,
right. But you see 2-year-olds who can, come in and grab an iPad, and they know how to go exactly to what they want to see. They, it's amazing. So we know the capability is there, but we've got to find the will to make it happen for everybody.
Right. So we have just like maybe 3 minutes left on our time here. And I do want to add one more comment here. And it was something that I thought was really incredible. I think Anastasia brought it up in a prior conversation about participatory budgeting. If I'm saying that right. I can't talk right now. I don't know I need another cup of coffee. Maybe, Anna, if you can just give a quick definition of what that is and what that would mean for Slavic Village in terms of inclusion and power.
So there's been a lot of, there's been conversations happening about, engaging in more conversations for people to kind of give their suggestions on where they see certain funds being allocated in their communities. So participatory budgeting, really just the community participating in, how the budget should be used on a city level. And so especially with a lot of funds coming in from the American Rescue Plan, there are different house meetings that are happening that we're trying to basically kind of gauge, where should this money go in the best way to, kind of revitalize certain areas and then rescue us from this pandemic that has just happened, figuring out, how we should see that. And so in the conversations I've witnessed, it's just definitely been around affordable housing, because kind of after this pandemic kind of not goes away, but is on the downward trend, if you will, homelessness is going to be at a very, in a very interesting and bad place. And just affordable housing in general. And so I would just say, participatory budgeting is just, grassroots level, really trying to figure out, what the community needs and where we should see that happen. So
yes, great. I wanted to make sure we got that in. So I want to give Earl a chance to jump in here really quick for a quick a plug for our huge event tomorrow. If you wanted to jump in there really quick, Earl.
Yeah, and I do want to jump in, sorry. Not only to plug tomorrow's event, but to say, I'm going to do this really quick, and I've been thinking about this in the call, just how much I appreciate all of you. Chris, your leadership in the community. Tim, we just met recently, but I have a feeling we're going to be friends for a long time. Ed, I so appreciate your tenacity and your willingness to tackle whatever's in front of you. Tom, I've explained Tom as he's one of the best community organizers that I've ever met. And I think he's my brother from another mother. Phyllis, I just so appreciate not just what you've done, but who you are. I mean, you have this kind of quiet, powerful presence in the community that's just really, that benefits us all. Pastor, if I haven't told you this already, for the rest of you, I'm Jewish, and Pastor Gibson may be the one minister that I'll go to see at his church just because he's such an inspiring leader. Anna, I think you are one of the, because nobody else that I met on outreach is on this call, I can say this, you are my favorite person that I met during outreach. And we've been doing outreach for 2 years now, so that's a lot of people. And Cynthia, you know how much respect I have for you. I just am in awe of your talents and your energy and your wisdom on stuff like this. So yeah, to Cynthia, I almost said Connolly, to Cynthia's point, we are having a forum tomorrow, a presentation by, there it is, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. She wrote the book that you see there, Biased. I've read it. It's an awesome, awesome book. She grew up in Huff and moved to Beechwood when she was about 12 years old. And in Beechwood, she talks about being one of 4 Black kids at Beechwood High. So one of the things that's fascinating about her is she has this kind of bipolar view of the universe. She can speak from different positions. So she went on to get a degree, and she went on to get a master's degree and then a PhD at Harvard. And then about 5 years ago, she was a recipient of one of those MacArthur Foundation Genius Grants for her work on racial bias in policing, which could not be more germane, not just to the country, but to Slavic Village in particular. So join us tomorrow if you can for the Zoom luncheon. You can eat your sandwich with your screen off and learn a lot. So with that, I'll turn it back to Cynthia for maybe kind of wrap up.
Yeah, that's definitely, there's a link in your chat box to get your tickets for tomorrow. If you cannot make it, you can also donate a ticket to the community so they may join. So that is also an option. And of course, if you cannot make either, please encourage you to go to University Settlement's website and make a donation, any amount. And the amazing work that Earl and his team has been doing is just unparalleled, and we're so grateful for Earl, your leadership and hosting this amazing discussion, having your homecoming events. We're really looking forward to the event tomorrow, and I guess we are good to go. I really appreciate everyone coming and wish everyone well and a great weekend.
Thank you.